Hi, this is Dr. Kevin Ewell, and you are in HIS381, and you are looking at this as the first of a series of videos that we're going to be talking about the Great Migration. And this is an interesting period because this is where you had a shift between the 1924 Immigration Act when Europeans were targeted and when the whole discussion was around creating a European identity for the United States, and the later years when you had African Americans very much in the framework. And what we'll be trying to discover in this lecture is how that shift came about and why it came about. So it's important to understand the dynamics of what happened in the 1930s whereby African Americans came into the frame. So first of all, we have the Great Migration. We can move on from that. We have African Americans coming into the frame. They were becoming the most important focus of race relations by the Second World War, and we need really to ask why. It wasn't an automatic assumption that you can make that African Americans should be the focus of all of this various of race relations. Certainly it isn't what observers like Robert S. Park talked about when he was talking about race relations. African Americans were not foremost in his mind in the 1920s when he did the survey of race relations, which discusses Japanese and Western and relationships on the Western coast between whites and Japanese. So first, the 1924 Immigration Act ensured that no more immigrants arrived in the United States. Hence, the assimilation dynamic pointed to by Park and Burgess came to a halt. I'm hoping you can see all of this because in the last one you couldn't. So here we have the loop, and the idea that Park and Burgess had was to create a dynamic whereby, or that it was explaining a dynamic whereby immigrants would come first into this area here, the sort of factory zone that they would, well, we'll go back there. They would move inside this zone here to be close to the factories. Before they had money to have, for instance, a car. It was full of bed and breakfast kind of accommodation. It was full of fairly transient people, and it was a poor area of the city. And in this zone came the new immigrants until they settled in. Then they would move to the zone of working men's homes. Hopefully you can see that down here. And as they progressed from there and became more middle class, they would move down to the residential zone, which is this circle around here. Finally, Park and Burgess talk about the commuters zone, which is way off there. Again, I've clicked. So we have the situation whereby these zones are set up by the continuous movement of immigrants into the area. And ironically, Park and Burgess talked about this simply at the very same time as it came to a halt, when you had no more immigrants coming into the loop here and able to go elsewhere. So so we're going to have to talk about the 1924 Act yet again, as I have to pose it, because I do talk an awful lot about that because it's a very important act. So the 1924 Immigration Act also meant that American identity was very much about skin color. Despite the Act's ostensible allowance for those of African descent, those framing the Act very much had assumed that nearly no, and assumed correctly, that nearly no Africans would come to the United States. And you recall, of course, that it was the 1870 nationality statute, or national citizenship statute, that allowed for free white persons and persons of African descent to become citizens of the United States. And it was this that meant that African Americans or Africans could come to the United States at any time. But of course, they didn't actually do so. So the most American were those from Northern Europe. And the least American, by implication, were those furthest away from the Nordic ideal. So therefore, despite the fact that the United States had this Immigration Act, despite the fact that it didn't focus on African Americans, it was really important that it shifted identity onto whiteness.